So thank you again and welcome. For today's session, we will be discussing some highlights from the previous 3 sessions of the Intertribal Dialogue series on the Wildfire Crisis Strategy implementation. We have a host of really great speakers and folks to spark our dialogue today, and I'm going to turn over to them shortly to get started. Few housekeeping items that I do want to remind everyone of. This is a dialogue series, so we'll hear from our speakers very shortly. We'll get a brief overview of what's been discussed, take-homes, as well as items that are still need further dialogue. And then we'll open it up for questions and comments. If you have questions at any time, you can raise your hand on the Zoom button at the bottom under reactions, or you could submit your questions via the chat box and we'll happily include those. It would be great. We're going to let each of our speakers introduce themselves, but if you want to introduce yourself via chat, you could share your name, where you're calling from, any pending questions you want to make sure we cover today on our last session. So with that, I'll start us out with introductions. Stephanie Lucero, National Center for Environmental Conflict Resolution, facilitating today's events. Assisting me is my colleague, Lauren Cordova. You just waved. If you have any direct questions on getting into Zoom, issues with your chat, Lauren or I are the people to chat in the chat box, or you can email either of us. Lauren will put the email address in the chat account. And with that, it doesn't look like we have anybody joining via phone, so I think we're good there. We do have a few folks that probably shared their link. So if you received a link from someone else and you didn't register, if you could go and press those 3 little buttons on the participant, rename yourself, I'll be able to call on anybody for questions. We have a lot of the same names throughout, so I want to make sure we can call on whoever needs to be called on. So with that, I am going to turn it over to our welcoming remarks from Brian Farabee. Brian, you want to take it away?
Thank you, Stephanie. Thanks so much for the opportunity to discuss how the agencies, tribes, and tribal organizations can work together to build sustainable career pathways in implementing the wildfire crisis strategy out west. My name is Brian Farabee again. I'm currently leading a small team on behalf of our chief, titled the Wildfire Risk Reduction Infrastructure Team. Our team is really helping to shepherd the implementation of the wildfire crisis strategy with a strong focus on strategic investments, procedural improvements, and policy changes, as a result of some of our public engagements. With the influx of funding in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act, our agency has an incredible opportunity to focus efforts in places where the risk is high and potential impact to communities is the greatest. It's an exciting time, a challenging time, and a humbling time. I'm hoping that most of you are aware of the engagement sessions that I spoke about earlier, and we hope that you participated in them as we launched, at the same time, our wildfire crisis strategy last year. One of the most consistent pieces of information we heard from these engagements is that workforce development and training is probably one of the biggest challenges we collectively face. We just don't have enough people or deep enough bench strength, if you will, is one of our biggest challenges. And I want to reinforce the opportunity before us to grow a strong collaborative workforce that focuses not only on fuels and traditional parts and skills, but it also focuses on other things like partnerships, NEPA compliance, program management, and communications as an example. So understanding tribal nation workforce development needs, capacity, constraints, goals, and opportunities is vital to the success in implementing the strategy and reducing the risk across these landscapes. It is incredibly thankful for continued work with the Intertribal Timber Council that's really helped us in this, a great deal. And the feedback and ideas that you all have provided in these early sessions of this dialogue series is really important. We've heard the importance of, turning agency direction into action from those who we've seen the Forest Service work to really make these corporate changes in how we work to advance tribal priorities while still struggling when it comes to on-the-ground implementation because of administrative challenges or the lack of employee training. We've also heard the importance of telling the story for tribal forestry and successes arising from accomplishments with the new funding opportunities. How these success stories are important to tribes and their recruitment and retention of employees. And we want to make sure that we're telling the partnership story in a way that is equitable to tribes and the agency. Finally, we know that capacity is a continuing issue when it comes to tribes, for the federal government, and for our partners abroad. And we've heard that again throughout these series and heard plans to address these long-term and discuss the potential of more immediate solutions to address that issue. We recognize that there is a lot being asked of you by the Forest Service and by other federal agencies. I recognize that you are faced with a lot of requests to engage in formal consultation, informal discussions, workshops, and roundtables, to name a few. However, it is still important that your voice and your ideas be heard, because they really do matter and they help us chart that path forward together. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your participation. And I look forward to hearing what you have to say in support of our collective work on this priority work. So thank you.
Thank you, Brian. And I'll turn it over to Jalith for some opening remarks. Go ahead.
Great. Thank you so much, Stephanie and Brian, and thank you everyone who's joined today. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. I'm Jill Calvera. I'm the Deputy Chief for State Private and Tribal Forestry in the Forest Service headquarters here in Washington, D.C. Appreciate the opportunity to follow Brian and say a few words at the opening of today's session. I'm really looking forward to the opportunity to learn from you all firsthand what the agency can do to further support tribal capacity building and co-stewardship. Hopefully, many of you participated in the Wildfire Risk Workforce Capacity Dialogue series. It's been ongoing, Stephanie said, and last year's Intertribal Roundtable on the Wildfire Crisis Strategy, both of which are joint efforts between the Forest Service and the Intertribal team. These important dialogues are integral to building a habit and a practice of co-stewardship between the Forest Service and tribes. In addition to continuing to build our collaboration, the tribal input provided through this work allows us to identify and act upon both obstacles and opportunities. We fully understand and appreciate our need to work with tribal partners to tackle the wildfire crisis, and can better do that by supporting tribal capacity building around wildfire risk reduction. Today, I really look forward to discussing the outcomes of the Workforce Capacity Series and how to further the Forest Service support and investment in tribal workforce capacity and development. I'm here to listen and discuss what's possible within the Forest Service, within our policy, what opportunities we have to do better and what we're doing in this area. The Forest Service culture is shifting to reclaim and expand upon our federal trust responsibility to tribes. And we're focused on tribal rights and interests in the national forest system. We're focused on addressing equity and uncovering barriers. Most recently, we released, and I hope many of you have seen, our plan strengthening tribal consultations and nation-to-nation relationships, the USDA Forest Service Action Plan. Commits the entire agency to learning more about our unique relationship with tribes, tribal consultation, co-stewardship, and more. We've also publicly changed the name of the administrative unit with oversight of tribal relations in the Forest Service, which you may have noticed when I introduced myself, and I'm really proud to have participated in that, and proud to introduce myself as the Deputy Chief of State Private and Tribal Forestry. And capital change, names are meaningful, and words matter, and it's something that if it's part of the tribal, the Forest Service Tribal Action Plan, we need to action on that. So I'll just name for you all. I'm not able to be with you the entire time today, but when I'm here and actively listening, I have people from my team here, and I always work very closely with them and his team as well. So I really appreciate your time today and look forward to identifying topics for these. So thank you for giving me a little bit of space and
Thank you, Jaleth. And we did know it was a little hard to hear some of what you're sharing, but we did put links in the chat box for the tribal consultation action plan that Jaleth mentioned. And likewise, we do have closed captioning, so that is available if you want to look at the video later as well. And I'm going to turn it over to our last welcoming remarks for today. Cody, that's the top. Go ahead.
Thank you, Stephanie. Welcome everybody again. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are. I'd like to thank Brian and Jaleth for their comments and just the agency in general for engagement on this. This is something we started conversations on almost as soon as the infrastructure bill was passed. So we look forward to continuing that engagement and developing a plan for how we build out this workforce, how we accomplish the goals and objectives set forth in the infrastructure bill, Inflation Reduction Act, and wildfire reduction plans. So when we look at this from a tribal perspective, we recognize that there's, I think, 574 federally recognized tribes the last time I looked at the Federal Register. We know we've got a variety of staffing capacities, different tribal priorities, depending on what our individual tribal sovereign governments dictate to us. But we've got to ask ourselves, to be successful in this, a number of questions. First is, how do we systematically grow capacity to accomplish both our on-reservation goals and help meet those off-reservation objectives, whether those be tribal objectives or objectives that the federal agencies are trying to meet? We do recognize, particularly at ITC, that much of our funding comes from the BIA, and those are dedicated to management of trust acres. So it doesn't give us a lot of flexibility as tribes. And where that flexibility does exist is typically with tribal funding. And we know that in many places, resources are minimal, and there's a lot of competing needs on tribal budgets. So it's really tough to sell that one to your respective tribal councils that we should be spending tribal dollars on adjacent federal land. So we do recognize that as a challenge. We also recognize that because of those limitations in funding, that we have limitations in staffing. So we're really challenged to meet our on-reservation management goals. And I'm excited to see the IFMAT 4 report, which should roll out. We'll have it official and available for our June symposium. Plan to have some conversation at the ITC symposium about that, and then development of an implementation plan. So we recognize we've come a long ways. We recognize we have a long ways to go. We will develop an implementation plan on how we do that over the next decade between IFMAT 4 and 5. Again, recognizing that we've gone from IFMAT 1 that was focused almost exclusively on how we manage our own acreage to how do we now share in this co-stewardship responsibility to collectively manage across the landscape, not just focused on those reservation acres. And then I guess that leads me to the next question, and probably the hard one to answer, the ones that we've heard the most about in this series is where do these workers come from? So we know that we're understaffed. We know that it's difficult to compete. We know that because of funding limitations, sometimes tribal pay scales aren't the same as everybody else's, which makes it even more difficult. But I think as tribes, we know where we've been successful. And I think for the most part, that comes from within, that we recognize that our own tribal members have very dedicated ties. A lot of programmatic or program managers, a lot of staff that we have that are very long tenured permanent staff have come from within. So how do we continue to grow that? How do we continue to develop their skill sets so that they're comfortable not only managing on reservation, but looking across the fence to see what opportunities there are across on adjacent federal land, and what would that workload look like? And then start to think about, from a longer term perspective, what would a workforce look like that could help accomplish those larger goals and objectives. We also know that we have to look outside because we have a difficult time recruiting from within. Natural resources, for whatever reason, seems to be one of those fields that we're losing interest in. But we are looking at, ITC has a workforce development plan, how we message that to younger generations to increase that. I did get a sneak peek at the IFMAT report. We did finally see an uptick in the 20 to 30-year-old demographic, which is great news because that was a horrid stat in the last one. We went from roughly 1.5% in the 20 to 30-year-old demographic to, I think we're up closer to 10. So we have made progress, and I want to note that progress. So it is possible. It is slow progress, but we are getting there. So with that, we know that there's both internal talent and external talent we'll have to recruit. I also think because there's so much funding available in such a short term that we're going to have to look to outside contracting capacity to help offset some of those near-term needs. Let's see. So what does success look like? That for us as tribes, I think that means we have the ability to accomplish both on-reservation goals and objectives and participate to the extent we have the capability and to meet those tribal priorities on adjacent federal land. And for many of you, those adjacent federal lands are managed by the Forest Service. And I think we know in places where this work is happening that once you build those relationships, they tend to persist over the long time, particularly if there's long-term staff there, that where we have personal relationships, cross-boundary work happens on a pretty regular basis, and idea sharing and planning comes along with that. But to do that over the long term, we do need a sustainable source of funding to build these programs, to hire additional staff, to give us that flexibility to accomplish not only our on-reservation goals, but those off-reservation goals as well. And that if we can do that, that gives the tribal programs a lot of flexibility to really ramp up wherever those priorities exist. So while it might be cross-boundary stewardship work this year, it might be fire rehab next year, or it might be some other catastrophic event that we can't foresee, or some climate change mitigation that we have to account for, that we just have horsepower to respond to that we don't right now. I think the BIA's goals are very wide and diverse when you look at what their requirements are to tribes, and they don't have a lot of funding to do that. But to the extent we can bring in other funding sources to just build internal capacity, that gives us the ability to address more things than what we currently can. So to me, that's what success looks like, that we find funding mechanisms, we find contract mechanisms that give us long-term sustainable funding sources that we can use to go out and create, recruit, build and train this workforce that will be needed for the next decade and probably number of decades to try to address this wildfire risk crisis we're facing right now. And with that, I'll wrap up my comments. Thank you, Stephanie.
Thank you, Cody. Thank you, Jaleth and Brian as well. Great introductions and opening remarks for today's session. Before we start getting into the main meat of our dialogue today of thinking through how do we get to the success as you outlined it, Cody, I want to make sure we have a little bit of a thought process of what we heard is currently underway in terms of workforce development implementation. And in order to do that, we have Rachel as part of the team that's helping put these on, has a brief overview of the series to date in terms of opportunities, as well as those questions that we still are hoping to cover today in terms of systematically growing tribal workforces. All right, so I'm going to turn it over to you, Rachel.
Thanks, Stephanie. Let me pull this up real quick. All right, there we go.
As a reminder, as Rachel's pulling that up, if you have questions during the presentation, please plop those into the chat. If you want to get into the queue, you can also raise your hand and take it away.
All right. Well, thanks again, Stephanie. And like Stephanie mentioned, my name is Rachel Neuenfeld. I am an engagement specialist on the Wildfire Risk Reduction Infrastructure team, and had the pleasure of working with ITC in planning and implementing this dialogue series. So I've really enjoyed listening and learning and just hearing the conversations and the exchanges that we've had throughout this series. So, and looking forward to today as well. As we heard from those opening remarks, we've covered a lot of ground with this series. So just want to take a minute for those who were able to join us to hear again some of those highlights, as well as those who maybe weren't able to join us for some of those earlier sessions. Some of what we've talked about, some of the highlights, some of these persisting barriers that we've heard. And we'll reiterate again, Stephanie mentioned that we have those recordings on ITC's webpage, as well as linked in the agenda and in an email that went out to everyone yesterday. So if you have the opportunity to watch those recordings, if you have any questions or want to connect with any of those speakers, please let us know. We're happy to help make those connections and really continue this learning opportunity and exchange. So a brief review of where we've been so far. We have covered a lot of ground with this, and when we started planning these sessions, we really wanted to focus on the next iteration from the intertribal roundtable we held last spring, as well as the roundtables that were held in partnership with the National Forest Foundation. And this topic of workforce development and workforce opportunities really came across the board, from tribes that we heard from Forest Service employees, and from partner organizations. So a really strong topic. And I think that the conversations that we've had these past 3 sessions have really shown that to be true. We started off talking about funding opportunities for workforce development. We heard from some of my Forest Service colleagues about some of the opportunities available right now, as well as from our Office of Grants and Agreements on some ways that they are working to make access to those opportunities even easier. In session 2, we really switched our focus to the workforce assessment. So taking a look at the whole sector workforce, how can we work together, the federal government, tribes, partner organizations, in a way that really starts to look at workforce across this entire sector. And then we moved into recruitment and retention and focused a lot on youth recruitment from both the Forest Service as well as some partner organizations like EcoTrust, who we heard from at that session. And we'll dig into these a little bit more as we go forward, and some of the opportunities that we heard from these, as well as those persistent barriers. So in ongoing work to support tribal priorities, we really started to hear a lot about some of the workforce development funding and opportunities that exist. So this is obviously a persisting issue, but there are some examples of areas that are really working and are starting to find some success towards this workforce development funding and opportunities, including the use of the community wildfire defense grants. That was an area of success, that people were starting to find some opportunities and funding that was working and moving forward. Along with some of our Tribal Forest Protection Act agreements, including a pilot fuels training module that we heard about in that first session. I mentioned that the Forest Service Office of Grants and Agreements has this access branch, which is really focused on connecting people who are trying to set up these contracts, these agreements, these get access to these grants, trying to set those up, trying to make sure that they're successful as we're going through. We know that there's a lot that has to be done to make sure you're meeting the milestones, that the correct mechanism is used. And this branch was one that was brought up as a potential success for this, although we did hear that there were some issues still with how do you get the word out about this type of information. And so we'll continue to focus on that as we move forward as well. And then again, these intergovernmental agreements for tribal workforce development, as well as templates for these agreements and training on these agreements that's available. We've heard a lot of resources about these that are, again, starting to become more universally known, more universally widespread, but there's still that access issue. How do we get the word out? How do we make sure that the right people have the right trainings or the right templates to be able to start this work effectively? Other ongoing work that supports these tribal priorities came up in our recruitment and retention session. So we heard about the newly formed Indian Youth Service Corps, which is focused on connecting Indigenous youth with employment and training opportunities. And we heard from Tina Terrell with the Forest Service on some of these recruitment for positions in the Forest Service and for tribes. She mentioned she's doing a lot of work with tribal colleges that is relevant in her world to work with the Forest Service, but we also talked about how that really expands to work across the natural resources sector for tribes, for the Forest Service, and for partner organizations. And we also mentioned some mentorship opportunities available in forestry, and wanted to include this link here for some tools that can connect some potential recruits with not only the positions, but some of the idea of the coursework that you might need to actually connect to these positions. We heard that that can be a barrier. We know that that's a barrier, not only for tribes, but for many people who are trying to work with the federal government. What are those actual requirements? What do you need? So trying to lay that out here with some of these resources. So while we did hear about a lot of those great opportunities, we know that there are persistent barriers and challenges towards supporting tribal priorities, and just wanted to capture a few here. So really looking at that sustained direct funding for workforce capacity and development, and focusing in on that direct local funding for this capacity and development. We heard from a lot of the tribes who had joined us that it really makes a difference when that is at a local level and that funding comes right to the tribe so that they have autonomy to support a workforce, they have autonomy to get equipment and supplies needed to actually sustain that workforce. And then reiterating that sustained point, we hear that over and over again with this type of work. We have these large sums of money that have come in right now from the bipartisan infrastructure law, from the Inflation Reduction Act, that are really important and really necessary towards spurring some of this work forward. But what can we do to make sure that we have sustained funding to support these workforces into the future, to keep that momentum going and to keep movement on this work as it begins? The next challenge here is incorporating the national standards of inclusion of tribal priorities consistently at local levels. So this came up in these conversations. We talk a lot about the work that the Forest Service is doing at a national level to work with tribes in implementing the wildfire crisis strategy, other priority work of the agency, and how we've started to partner and what that partnership looks like and the role it's taking on, but that's not always seen at different levels of the Forest Service, that there's maybe a disconnect, whether it's because of training needs or other barriers that are getting in the way at the local Forest Service level. So how can we work as an agency to make sure that we are incorporating those national standards of inclusion that we hold important for the agency at all of these different levels, and making sure that we're including these tribal priorities in all levels of the work that we're doing? And then here, the last challenge listed on this page is supporting the tribes in maintaining their workforces. So, this again came up countless times throughout these conversations and others, really looking at not just building up a workforce for the Forest Service, but how can we as federal agencies or other partner organizations who might be on here work to support tribes in maintaining their own workforces? And Cody mentioned the tribal wildfire pay equity and other pay equities that came up as persistent barriers. We heard about the need for maybe some partnership in finding housing availability for some of these remote locations. So this again is an issue that comes up in these conversations with tribes. It also comes up with Forest Service employees. We know that housing availability can really be a persistent barrier. So how can we look at it from all angles and not just from the agency angle? Looking at increased certification opportunities. So we heard that sometimes it's not even the certifications themselves, but some of those administrative barriers like the medical clearance that's needed in order to take the PAC test to get a red card can be a barrier. So how can we as an agency, how can we as tribes, the agency and partners work together to increase those certification opportunities? And then we had a really great presentation on workplace conditions and addressing mental health, both for wildland firefighters as well as other employees. So how can we really take that information and include it in the work that we're doing to implement the wildfire crisis strategy, so we don't get to a place of burnout or a place where we're really working too few people too hard to try and do this work. Continuing on some of these challenges, we looked at in general, the recruitment and retention for diverse workforces. So we talked, like I mentioned, with Tina Terrell about some of the work she's doing to recruit and retain tribal workforce into the Forest Service. But how can we look again at that holistic picture of recruitment and retention of diverse workforces across this sector? And then moving into ensuring tribal innovation in forestry is acknowledged, shared, and funded. We heard through these conversations that sometimes, as this work is moving forward, the success stories that are shared or the kind of acknowledgements of funding are really coming to partner organizations or to the Forest Service. And it's hard for tribes to be able to tell their story. And if you can't tell the story, you can't capitalize on it for additional funding or additional opportunities. So how can we work to ensure equity in actually sharing this story, telling this story, because we know that it's really going to take everyone to do this work. So how are we sharing and telling that story? And then finally, the challenge here of reducing administrative burdens for agency funding. again, this came up over and over again throughout this. We really focused in on it on our first session with our Office of Grants and Agreements. And they mentioned that they talked about that access branch that they have, which is a really successful opportunity for people to get some information as they're starting to set up these new agreements or contracts. But again, how do we increase the awareness of those opportunities? How can we make sure that people know that we have these resources available? And if those resources still aren't helping, is there more that we can do to provide more availability of resource or start to reduce some of those administrative burdens? So I know that was quite a lot of information. We covered a lot of ground over the past few months here, but just again, some key takeaways and lessons learned from that. Just to reiterate again, before we move into our discussion, really focusing on solving and funding the workforce issues at that local level. And again, with that direct funding. And again, that need to overcome those complicated administrative capacity needs is going to really help ease the burden on both tribes, agencies, and partners. The insufficient qualified workforce for everyone, and note the emphasis here on qualified and everyone. It's not that we don't have workers all the time, but we know that there are barriers to actually getting people into some of these positions because of the qualifications that are set up. And we know that this is across the board. We know that the Forest Service has issues with it. We heard from all of you that tribes have issues with it. So how can we address that? And how can we use partnerships to meet some of those current needs? We talked a lot about long-term recruitment and retention and youth workforce, but what do we do right now? How can we start to address some of those needs? And how can we work with partners, including partners like industry, to help meet some of those current needs? Again, focusing on that lack of recognition and funding on par with partners and federal agencies, helping tribes to actually have that recognition, have that funding, share in that so that they can capitalize on that success. And then sustained funding. So again, just focusing in on this sustained funding for this workforce development. It's great to have these funds available right now, but what can we do into the future? What are the plans into the future to make sure that we can sustain this workforce that we're building, that we are recruiting for, and that we're retaining so that we can continue to do really good work together. So as we move into the discussion today, I really hope that this sparked some inspiration for those who weren't able to join us, or for those who, for whom it's been a couple months since you've heard some of this information. And just want to make sure, as we're talking today, what are some of those persisting barriers and workforce capacity challenges to effectively implementing the wildfire crisis strategy? And on the flip side of that, what are some of those successes that maybe you've seen that you could share with us today, even if it's things like pilot programs that could be capitalized on to increase some of the effectiveness of this work? And then for our leadership today, focusing in on what's that decision space to actually address these barriers? Is it held with the agency? Is it held at a different level? And within that decision space, what options exist to address these issues? So with that, I'll turn it back over to Stephanie and we can start our conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. That was a very robust overview of the last 3 sessions leading us up to today. So I'll just check in really quickly with Cody, Brian, or Jalith if there's anything you want to add to the overview we had. And this will give folks some time to kind of think through any questions or comments or suggestions they have as well. Anything to add?
Just one that I probably should have mentioned in mine, but we do recognize that we're all competing for that same small group of talent out there. So I think to the extent that we can share where we've been successful. So I think I've shared examples, I think in the first one where you might not have capacity in all aspects of natural resource management, but you might have capacity in certain aspects. And the example I think I used then, and that's still pertinent now, is cultural resource departments within tribes. Those are typically very strong. They have people that know the culture. They know the places that federal staff, particularly new federal staff, likely won't. So those are places where we can be additive. And it's typically a place where the federal agencies struggle a bit to recruit those folks. So we can really fix one of those bottlenecks that's preventing projects from getting to the finish line in a timely manner.
Great. Thank you, Cody. And I saw from Brian and Jayla, they felt pretty confident in terms of what we went over. So we've already identified a focus. Thank you, Cody, for that for today. In terms of, we know a bottleneck is staffing. Tribes can be a robust source for cultural resource. So the pathway to success for that is really improving opportunities, reducing the administrative burdens to contract and enter into agreements with tribes for those cultural resources issues on the wildfire crisis implementation and other avenues. And we have some pathways there, right? We know there's the access branch that can be utilized, and we made good contact with those folks in terms of identifying possible projects and agreements and funding. What are some other either pathways we can already identify today that we've talked about, maybe connect the dots as a group, or are there other issues that folks didn't hear in our overview but are experiencing in workforce development, workforce capacity on wildfire risk? Just want to open it up for comments, questions, suggestions for the larger group. Were we that good? Did we cover them all? All right, it's looking like Rowena, you went on camera. Have any thoughts?
Yeah, I was late to the program. I didn't get to listen in to the first couple of them, but one of the things that we're doing here at Region 5 is I'm trying to develop a tribal capacity portfolio so that we can find out which tribes have what kind of experience and qualifications that we need if we're looking for tribal work crews, if we're looking for tribal transportation programs. If they have a transportation program, they have equipment and they have certified equipment operators. If they have a really good environmental department, they could help with NEPAs. Right now here at Region 5, we really do need GIS technicians. We could partner with tribes to do it, but the problem is we don't know which tribes have what. So we are trying to develop right now it's just a spreadsheet, but I was thinking seeing this just from the conversation you guys are giving the wrap up of all the other meetings you had, it sounds like if we had maybe a central kind of place where we could go to find out what tribes have work, what kind of things that they have, a workforce that they could help with the Forest Service and this wildfire program. And then which tribes need certain kind of capacity development in certain areas. They have a lot of people who want to do fuels reduction, but they need to have somebody or an organization to come out there and help them train it up. We have one pilot program here at the Mendocino where it's a partnership between a nonprofit, the Forest Service, and they not only train up tribal members in the area to do fuels reduction, but they also have traditional practitioners go out there and talk to them about working on their ancestral lands and how important it is. And they kind of mix some of the TEK with that training as well. There's a few of those, I think, around that, but I know for a fact that one's actually partnering with the Forest Service to do that. So it'd be great if we could have some kind of, I don't know, SharePoint site, some kind of program that we could put this information in so that people who can work in the workforce can partner with their local forest or somebody who's looking for training. All of that kind of in a central location would be great.
Thanks, Rowena. Like to hear thank you actually for what you shared, because it tells us the industries that we need to be looking for, either tribal industries or other, transportation, industry, cultural resource programs, as Cody mentioned, GIS technicians. These are all things we identified. I also wanted to stress that you were talking about tribal capacity, both in terms of what the Forest Service needs to meet needs, but also identifying what the tribes need. So maybe that's starting that conversation. We talked a lot about different pieces. One avenue to look at would be also thinking through in that dialogue, hey, we have funding to do this type of work. This is what we need to do it. Do you have it? And Barbara Long on the chat, I don't know if you want to jump in more, just suggested having that, framework of this is what we need. What do you need? And that's the creating those personal relationships that Cody mentioned, picking up the phone, having a call saying, hey, we need to get this work done. Is there something you'd be interested in? What do you need to do it? Yeah.
We have, it's just, it's a long time consuming process. Instead of us going out and asking every single tribe, what do you have? It'd be better if we had a central location where the tribes could actually put that information into some kind of system to tell us what they have.
And possibly like, hey, we have the resources to support this partnership here. So, you know, a little bit of everything, right?
Right, yeah, and then we might, yeah, and they could put in, say, we do have, you know, a lot of people who need jobs, and so we definitely could use this training in this certain area, you know, so that might be somewhere we could connect them with the local people who do that kind of training.
Okay. And getting some comments here in terms of Barbara. Barbara, did you want to jump up or just stick with comments in the chat? I know not everybody is good at looking at chat, so I'll just read the comments from Barbara. Just also acknowledging, you know, for some tribes, it's going to be different. We've heard that a lot in terms of capacity. Some tribes might have the capacity to reach out, may not have the capacity to put the input. It's really about finding different options. So thank you, Barbara, for adding in that piece as well. And thank you, Rowena, for getting us started in dialogue. Any other thoughts in terms of solutions, resources, connect the dots for what we've discussed? Go ahead.
Hi, thanks, Stephanie. I'm Halem Clark, and I'm currently on a detail with the Pacific Northwest Wildfire Crisis Team. And what I've been doing in this detail is really looking at science opportunities for wildfire crisis work, sort of like how might science better support wildfire crisis work. And the way I'm going about this, which is where the overlap here is sensing internal staff and also partners, including tribes in the Pacific Northwest. So I wanted to just reinforce what was said earlier about sort of access to training and sharing resources based on a kind of a pretty specific example of something that was suggested by one tribe that I spoke with, and that's around prescribed fire and offering sort of training in common and then sharing resources to pull off prescribed fire. Also using tribal staff to meet kind of minimum staffing requirements on prescribed fire. And a suggestion was for the Forest Service to help tribes build up their prescribed fire program and staff so that this kind of work can be done kind of in a more of an all lands approach. So, you know, I'm guessing I wasn't able to attend the other sessions, but I'm guessing that this was potentially a topic of conversation earlier.
We had a bit of discussion in terms of the need for the science background and the scientists in the area, and Jalith looks like has some thoughts on that. So I'm going to turn it over to Jalith. Go ahead.
Okay, well, first, is my audio any better? Because I think I changed my microphone. Okay,
It's
sorry,
great.
everyone. I had heartfelt opening remarks, but anyway, I'm not very good at Zoom, despite the fact that we've been doing this for 3 years now. Should be better at it, right? So I wanted to lean in on what Nahalem just shared, more around the prescribed fire part, not the science part, as that is not my lane, but a couple opportunities just to mention. We do work across lands for prescribed fire. Of course, we lean heavily on our tribal partners and traditional ecological knowledge, and are leaning more into that all of the time when it comes to prescribed fire, because we know that our tribal nations have been using this tool for a millennium. So as we come out, get ready to come out with some learnings from the pause that we took on prescribed fire and some longer term implementation work that we've been doing, I'll just mention a couple of opportunities. We are looking to grow our prescribed fire training academy. There's one in the east in Tallahassee. Many of you may be familiar with that. It's not just a Forest Service entity, it's a partner-based entity. We have tribal partners on the board. We're looking to expand that more to the west. So we'll be coming out with some more specifics around that soon. But really, it's about training practitioners, not Forest Service people, not federal people, practitioners, and growing this workforce overall, especially in place-based communities. So that's one opportunity for tribes and others that will be coming out with soon. And then I'll just mention here too, folks may be aware of, or maybe Brian or others have mentioned in previous sessions, that we're making some large investments in agreements using the funding that we got from IRA. We call them Keystone agreements, to help us really up our game in partnering, working on the National Forest System lands, but through and with partners. And we'll be exploring doing that with a specific tribal focus. Of course, Cody will be working with ITC and other groups. And I think there could be many component parts to that around all kinds of capacity, like we're talking about today, but in particular, probably prescribed fire, but many of the other things that we're talking about. So, we welcome folks' creative juices flowing there. We can be pretty broad in how we think about the partnering. We're a little limited by the funding that we got in IRA, because it does have to be used on National Forest System lands and the wildland interface. So anyway, I just put those out there for, put in backs of people's minds to start ruminating on. So thanks, Stephanie.
Thank you. And then we had a good comment, just also thinking through identifying the workforce needs, workforce availability at a local level. Sherry was sharing that tribes don't necessarily know what they need in terms of workforce development, in terms of implementation of these, and likewise may not have an understanding of what resources they have to provide to Forest Service. And one of the examples, you can all read this in the comment, but just in case that's not comfortable for you, Sherry was emphasizing really the importance of those relationships that Cody referenced, the conversations about what are the opportunities and needs for work, either through consultation or informal, or those local dialogues. We talked a lot about the local dialogues. And the example Sherry provides is land surveyors came up in a conversation when they were working between tribes in Oklahoma a few years back, and hadn't even thought of the possibility of using tribal land surveyors or the need for them. And it really helped think through what capacity the tribe had to support. There's sometimes this focus on the natural resource side or specific ecologists, and not necessarily touching on some of those other resources, as Jalith and Neelam has mentioned, that might be indigenous knowledge holders, or land surveyors for GIS and other opportunities. So I wanted to bring that into the room, and also just the emphasis of having those conversations and using those conversations to make those local assessments of workforce needs and capacity. So thank you for those of you sharing those in the comment box. Any other thoughts on these pieces or anything to add?
Stephanie, along those lines. So, we have 21 landscapes now that we're working in. 10 of those are in their second year and have done some learning. And so in this space around what capacity, what skill sets might folks want to think about and need, be happy to use some of the experience from year one, and at least those initial in landscape, to help facilitate discussions around that to the degree people might want or would like. It may not be all inclusive, but there has been some learning that might be beneficial and speed up some of it for others. We're using those first 10 to help inform the second 11 that we just announced in January, but in that same light.
And we've heard a lot about that, the importance of looking at those shared lessons and lessons learned. Cody, go ahead.
And maybe for the tribal folks on the call, I know we're talking and primarily focusing on those technical specialists from a natural resource perspective, but do you have limitations on the administrative side, contracting officers, accounting staff that can submit SF 425s, other non-natural resource related limitations that maybe haven't spoke about yet?
Yes, this is Tim Sexton with the Climate Tribes. And we do have limitations on our ability to develop agreements and to accept funds. And any administrative help in that arena would be very helpful.
Hi, Tim Sexton. Say hi. Tim and I worked together for years. Dare I go out on a limb here? I don't know that there's anyone on here from GNA, Brian, and maybe Alicia can help, but in my experience, many of the instruments and agreements we enter into with partners to include tribes, we can help with that, right? It doesn't have to be for that, but we can help with that as part of the, can be named in the budget for the agreement. We can support that. So just, we can provide more information from someone who's an actual expert, but, important to call it out and it can be supported. Yes. Okay. Alicia's got to make sure I'm in the right lane.
And I do want to point that out because I mean, as big as Colville is, I've got 1,500 employees working for me. We recognize that there's so much money in the infrastructure bill across so many different functional areas that we had to go out and hire 6 different contract grant writers to try to take advantage of as much of that funding as we could. So depending on what your tribal priorities are, natural resources may not be at the top of the list. It may be some of that public infrastructure funding. It may be some of the health funding that was available. So again, recognizing that we have limitations already and that there's so much over so many areas, I would encourage tribes to maybe do something similar, that if you don't have that internal capacity, look for contractors outside that, at least in the short term, can add horsepower to get this stuff done in the near term.
And we have a lot of partnerships on the phone as well. So I would encourage those of you joining from nonprofit organizations or other possible partnerships to think of that as another avenue to support tribal and federal agency partnerships. Brian, I saw you go off mute. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think to Cody's point and to go back to some of my opening remarks, I think he's right. We typically think about what it takes from a natural resource perspective to deliver this work, but there's a whole host of skills that are required if you want to be well-rounded and be able to collectively tell your story as well as get the work done. And so, and I think, from my own learning, we focus there as well, but we quickly started to understand we needed people to help with data management in order to bring it forward, to be able to communicate and tell stories, which is going to be critically important, right? In addition to the comms people to help shape and tell that story. So there very much is this broader need that we would definitely suggest and can here get help in the thinking beyond natural resource specialists to really deliver this work.
And we have a couple of comments. I just want to, Alicia, did you want to add to that at all?
Yeah, just mentioning, I think, Stephanie, you probably have a link, and if you don't, I'll find it, about the new Forest Service Access Portal, which is a roadmap and a pretty cool tool. It's relatively new, and I haven't explored it extensively, but we'll get you that link as well, even if you're not, if you aren't able to hire someone to help you do that or leverage other assistance. We've got some tools that are available.
Yeah, and we did plug the access email address into the chat box. I'm also going to put the link to the website there as well. On this partnerships and agreements, we had a comment. Christy, I don't know if you want to share it live or want me to read it to the comment. Just open that mic if you want to start adding anything. But Christy in chat mentioned that in a previous role in Alaska, the native forest partnerships were useful because it wasn't just U.S. Forest Service, it was also U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, nonprofits, NRCS, but they were able to increase tribal capacity, training, and create partnerships that were tribally driven. So that's a good success story or tool that was utilized. And to create a space for future funding and leverage technical assistance resources. So that's maybe a lesson learned or a template or an example that folks are suggesting. Christy, did you want to add anything to that? we had a question also from Karina. And this is similar to kind of sharing resources, not so much people resources, but just other resources. And Karina was asking whether we've talked about sponsoring tribal partners for PIV cards. Those are the federal employee cards, identification cards, or link passes. We haven't really discussed that in detail, Karina, but I think the point you make in terms of while we're focusing on workforce capacity, there are also limitations in just sharing data, and that can streamline things. So Karina is mentioning that as an archaeologist, I'm most interested in sharing NRM heritage database, both so tribes can search for sites that aren't in the SHPO records ahead of surveys, and they can enter in site data. So kind of help with those cultural resources. We talked a lot about equipment. I think this is also a similar vein of workforce capacity, equipment, and systems is those databases. And then Jimmy McKenzie, I think, is responding to the archaeologist discussion about the utilizing the Forest Service Enterprise Group for resources. So that's another avenue to address some of the needs we've identified. So we'll clock those for the data sharing and some of the connections that were outlined. So thank you for those in chat that are having a really great conversation. I am cognizant of time, and I do want to make sure that we have an opportunity to think through next steps. I think we've identified a few items to really hone in on, but I also wanted us as a group collectively to think through where do we go from here? What are the pathways to address some of the items we've heard? So one item, and I'm hearkening back to Rachel's excellent slides. We've talked a lot about solving the workforce issues and addressing them at a local level in terms of conversations, communication, identifying capacity needs, both from a people power as well as equipment and resources. I think that also gets to dealing with what Cody mentioned is competing for a very small group of talent and how to do that in a productive way. A lot of it is that coordination and collaboration we've just been discussing. But I did want to get to the sustained funding and workforce development. So we know from session 1 that a lot of the funding currently available, both for work on tribal lands and off tribal lands, is very much focused on getting acres treated. And while there are opportunities identified in that session for building workforce capacity and workforce development tied to the acres treated, there's still this underlying issue of sustained funding and workforce development. And so I'll turn first to our speakers, but if anybody has some ideas of how do we address that piece? What is the step forward? What can we do in this group within our capacity to move that dialogue forward in terms of recommendations and next steps? So I'll first turn to Brian, Jalith, or Cody if you have some thoughts, and then I'll also opening it up to the main room.
Stephanie, I'll put my voice in just because I do have to leave here at the top of the hour. I'm sorry to do that. No silver bullet, obviously, capacity and workforce needs. You know, what I would say is I think viewing it as a partnership across all spectrums is helpful. You know, the private sector, the nonprofit sector, state foresters, tribes. I mean, there's needs across, and like Cody said, we often end up competing with each other. So are there ways that we can come together? Like I think of jointly recruiting even at events like Society of American Foresters or, you know, other national meetings. So the Forest Service, we have some limitations on our social media. Other partners don't. You know, putting out there, like our state partners have some cool social media appealing to folks coming into the workforce or even younger out there on platforms like TikTok to say, hey, this is what it looks like to be like a forest entomologist, or this is what you do a day that you're working in the woods. And I think tribes also have a unique capacity to reach young people who are interested to coming into this workforce through the means by which they communicate. Which, you know, frankly, in the federal government, we have barriers to doing. So just a couple ideas, not a panacea, but I think if we can come together and leverage all of our strengths, that's more powerful than trying to compete, even if we're doing that unintentionally. So, thanks.
Thanks, Jay. For jumping in. Cody, let's go to you then, Brian.
And completely agree with Jalith. And I would add that I know that people have referred to this as once in a career funding or an investment in the future, but I really think this gives us opportunity if we can build that workforce to demonstrate that the base funding need is much higher than what we've got. So right now, particularly in Indian country, we're usually limited on base funding. A lot of the funding that we would go after is competitive, so you don't know from one year to the next how much funding you're going to have to support a program. So if we can be successful over these next 5 to 10 years, if we can demonstrate to Congress what these investments can buy them, I suspect that will mean base appropriations go up and we can retain the model that we've built, and that those staffing are there for the longer term. And again, I think that's a challenge because the timeline is so short, but it's an effort we have to try. I think we can get a long ways, probably not spend all the money, I don't think, but again, to the extent we can demonstrate success, that will give us a lot of leverage and power when we're lobbying for future appropriations.
Yeah, I was going to go just where Cody went. Really, it's one thing to organize to implement the work, but we also have to talk about the work, and we have to talk about it in a way that it connects to people, that they understand the value and importance of the work, and really almost like their day-to-day lives. And so, from my perspective, getting away from these influx of funding, as opposed to really having our base programs increase over time, long term, I think this is a real opportunity for us to do it. But I think we're gonna have to do it from an all hands perspective, right? And it's gonna take these collective voices to talk about the work and help the greater American society see the value and importance of this work.
So I'm hearing a couple themes in terms of next steps and what needs to be done. Clearly, we need to keep building on the partnerships in a larger sense, really capitalizing on different strengths in terms of recruitment, retention, and sharing the story of the importance of this work, as you mentioned, Brian, and building off what Jalith also said. And I think that also touches on a little bit of what we heard and what was outlined by your comments, Brian and Rachel's, is making sure the story is told from every perspective, right? Forest Service perspective, nonprofit perspective, tribal perspective, that those voices are heard and the people that those voices speak to are hearing that message. And then also thinking through the larger, greater public message, the importance of kind of outreach and explanation of what this work is and how it affects daily lives. And I think tying that all together in terms of how do we get sustained funding is showing, look at the good work we did. We've got these great success stories, but we can do more with more. And sustained more. So the base funding piece, what does the base funding look like? What can be moved forward in terms of funding? I just want to make sure I'm kind of capturing that, because part of what we're going to do is a report for all of you on these sessions. What are the other pieces that we need to really outline for the greater public, the greater American public, for Congress? Cody, you mentioned, what do we need to do for lobbying for appropriations? Obviously, that's not the role of this space, but what we talk about is what you bring, and those that can go into those decision spaces bring forward as this is what we heard in this dialogue. So what else do we need to add to that, Cody?
Well, to Brian's point, I mean, you've got to show the public that it's good investment of their tax dollars. And I think, for if there's any BIA folks on here, they've heard me say this before, but OMB has consistently said, are we getting good bang for our buck when we invest in safe fuels funding? And I've always argued that it's hard because you can't give us 100,000 one year and $1 million the next year. Otherwise, I'm going to build a $100,000 program because I can't send those other guys home the following year. But if they give us consistent funding to build good programs, we will consistently put out good work that over the long term reduces risk, protects communities and infrastructure for the duration. It's not a once a generation or once a career appropriations bill. So I think that's the message we've got to sell to the public, that these are good investments of their tax dollars that benefit them collectively across the country.
Do we have any thoughts on how best to share that story? One comment we heard in preparing for the dialogue was the difficulty in just getting, so we talked about administrative support. There's also a lack of, at least from the tribal perspective, what I've heard, those folks to write the success stories, to publish them, to put them into literature. Is there a partnership opportunity there? And I'm looking to Forest Service, I'm looking for state, I'm looking to nonprofit partners. Maybe there are tribes that are really good at telling those stories. So that's another thing to think about, is who can help craft that story. Brian?
Yeah, I think there is a partnership opportunity there for sure. And I would say even for us who have communication specialists, we too are even looking beyond just what we have internally. And there are some very unique skills when it comes to this storytelling. That, you know, sometimes we hit the mark, sometimes maybe not to the degree we want. So so we're looking at our own capacity internally, looking at maybe contracting opportunities. And I think there's opportunities to partner with tribes. And as Jayla mentioned earlier, you know, being clear and specific about some of the needs. So when we're entering into agreements, we can make sure we're thinking about how they clearly meet them.
I'm wondering if, based on the discussions we've had, what we need to include in kind of the report out of this dialogue is what are all the needs that are identified? Because there's a few that were identified in the intertribal roundtable and the roundtables last year, but we've come up with a lot more in the last few dialogues that we need to just kind of remind folks of what those are, to have those conversations. Hey, did we cover administrative needs? Did we cover what the tribe has that they might want to contribute in terms of transportation, GIS, cultural resources? Do we have who's going to tell the story to report out the good work? So I wanted to flag that. I also want to make sure I give Elizabeth had a comment about creation of a tool of capacity. Elizabeth, do you want to share a little bit more of that from your comment in the chat box?
Yeah, sure. In doing this kind of work for a very long time, and what I'm hearing from the success stories that we've been hearing now and in previous meetings, I think it's critical that we remember that building capacity is a tool to meet an end, and that end is the programs where we are bringing together that co-stewardship, managing with the indigenous knowledge input, creating that bigger picture of what it is that needs to happen inside of that, which brings us to what tools do we need to be able to accomplish that. One of them is capacity building. So the capacity building isn't the end goal, it's a tool to get to those end goals without having, just keeping that forefront in the brain, not in the back of the brain. It allows us to actually answer those questions about how do we get to longevity? What sort of tools do we need the people who we are trying to build the capacity of? What skill sets are we actually looking for to meet that end goal? And I understand we're talking about the wildfire crisis strategy and the priority landscapes, but it still applies within those two major issues, because it has to be planned at the local level. So I would just caution people to keep that forefront in your brain, that a lot of those questions can be answered, not maybe nationally, but at the regional or more local level, by keeping in mind how that engagement for co-stewardship and integration of indigenous knowledge looks within that specific tribe or those specific tribes and that specific area where we're going to be doing that work.
Thanks, Elizabeth. And it looks like I'll just point to Rowena and Rosalie out of Region 5 from Forest Service, mentioning that Pacific Southwest Research Station has been collecting best practices for stewardship that might be good pieces for the storytelling. And then Rosalie is sharing that their travelation program is working on a storytelling team to showcase those success stories. And so the suggestion is maybe to create something in the Washington office to help showcase those stories nationally and again, get them in the local level. I'm recognizing we have a lot of Forest Service voices in the room. I want to check for our tribal audience, tribal representatives on the phone. Are there any items you want to add that you don't think were covered? Want to make sure you have a chance to get your voice in the discussion as well. All right. Let's see. If you all want to put it in the comments, you can as well. Let us know. So in terms of next steps and thinking through, we've identified a few goals or comments we want to emphasize for next steps. Is there anything we need to talk more about in terms of, increasing that base funding and also just reporting on what can be done with the workforce we have now under the current implementation plan? We've talked about incorporating the lessons learned. We've talked about telling the stories in an equitable way. We've talked about being really cognizant of all of the other workforce needs, not just the fire or natural resources, but administrative, public relations, communications pieces, collaboration pieces. Anything else we need to make sure we pull together from all these different pieces? Cody?
I don't know that we touched on it specifically, but I know we were planning to look at persistent barriers that we know available workforce is a problem, but why is that a problem? Is it that we don't have enough kids coming out of college with natural resource related degrees? Are we losing them to somebody else? Is it just availability of funding? So, I mean, I know we've touched on a bunch of things, but it would be good to have more definition about what those are. Because ultimately it's helpful for, say, the ITC board to have a defined problem so that we can try to come up with solutions. Because I don't know that it helps in my experience if you go to Congress and tell them what your problems are. They'll say, thanks for coming, we're aware of the problem. But if you've got an ask, this is what we would request to fix those problems. That's particularly helpful, but we need a clear definition of what the problem is to come up with a solution.
Yeah, and I would say that we had a little bit of a lot about that in our recruitment and retention session. So maybe we can spell out some of those, and I'll outline them right now, and if folks want to add to it. So it was kind of that diverse workforce issue that we talked about is really what's covered, and I'll invite anybody else that joined that. So it was kind of a little bit of everything, right? So in terms of the issues for recruitment and retention is the folks that are interested in doing the work, when they get to apply for the jobs, the classes that they took don't easily follow through. So that was where we were connecting with Forest Service work to identify, this is the work you want, these are the types of coursework we're looking for. The other component, there was also a lot of just different folks, either from worldview, gender, demographic differences. They have different needs in terms of recruitment and retention. There's a lot more women getting into the academic pieces needed for the work, but in the workforce, they're not maintaining that space in the workforce as long as maybe some of the male counterparts. Likewise, there's not enough men taking the academic pieces getting through. So this was some of the work that EcoTrust was sharing in terms of their review of barriers for recruitment and retention. So it was kind of a little bit of everything was needed. The other component that we heard in these dialogue series, and we'll spell out, was the difficulty of getting qualifications and training. So you're in the workforce, you're at a lower level, but the availability in some of the more remote locations to do the fire qualifications for fire suppression, the difficulty of getting those when you need them, the fact that it could take many years to actually get the work and then you're aged out at 50. That there's different qualifications for different agencies, and that makes it really complicated. So we touched a little bit about those, of just the difficulties of getting into the field. And we can outline those in very granular detail in the report. There was one other I was thinking of that came up. Health, mental health. So another thing we targeted in terms of retention is that this is grueling work, and it's usually a small group of folks that are doing very grueling work. And one, we need more folks doing the work, but also how are we supporting those folks on fire day in and day out during a large piece of time for their mental health so that they can continue to work and we can retain those positions. So those were some of the specific identified problems with some solutions, but not as many. And we can definitely put those in the report for folks to take and say, hey, these are the problems. And if folks have some ideas for solutions, as Cody mentioned, please bring those up. Does that help, Cody? Awesome. Is there anyone we missed in terms of if you didn't join our recruitment and retention discussion, or just know what else are we missing? All right. We have a very quiet group today, which that's fine. It's spring break for a lot of folks, right? So we are getting close to the time we have today, and Alicia was sharing a few tribal relations consultation dates on tribal consultation on equity and barriers. So if folks want to join those, please feel free to jump in on those, and we will have some reports. I don't know if you'll have them in time for those April 24th sessions, but please feel free to look at the materials we had and any of the items we shared if you want to bring that to that discussion as well and come up with some additional ideas. The intent of these dialogues is really to continue the discussion and narrow in on those solutions and opportunities to move the dial. I also want to pinpoint, if you're really interested in how industry can work on this, we are coordinating some of the follow-up items in terms of how industry can be a partner in building the current workforce. And we flagged that as a question for the U.S. Endowment to bring to their Tribal Industry Roundtable on April 27th. If you're interested in joining that session, we've got the hyperlink in the chat box for that as well. And we will send that all out in emails for folks as a follow-up if you registered for today. So I just want to open it up to our participants. Is there items we missed or there questions that are still pressing? Anything you want to add? I know, Brian, you mentioned echoes of ITC's previous work on marketing and branding, so we might want to pull some of that up, but I don't know if you wanted to add to that at all. All right. Well, then I'll just turn and see if there's any questions or comments from our speakers. Cody, Brian, if you had anything to add in our closing remarks.
I would just say that this will be an ongoing project. So we'll try to continue to make progress. We'll try to continue to provide updates. We know this is something that we're going to have to build from the ground up, essentially, because it was such a large sum of money in two separate appropriations bills, very close together. We are making progress. I think you saw the chief's I guess press release that went out. We've got 11 and probably more signed co-stewardship agreements in place. Another 61 were in the works. So we are making progress on this, but the more dialogue we have, the more collaboration we have, I think the faster it can move and the better the outcomes will be. So I'll just encourage people to stay engaged. We appreciate your participation today, but it's still needed in the future.
Yeah, I would just like Stephanie to say, one, just thanks to all the participants for today, but also if they joined the previous three as well, need this engagement, need the support. And we know everybody's busy, but we really want to, as best we can, work in this space collaboratively and collectively. And so I just want to say thanks with a lot of gratitude. And like Cody, there's some short-term needs, there's no doubt about that, but this is a long game. And we need to be thinking about what it means to us, not only short-term, but long-term after IRA and deal has been long gone.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Cody. And we'll send a thank you to Jalith. Alicia mentioned Washington Office of Communications has hired a tribal relations specialist, so we might be able to communicate some of those items out. We will be following up with all of you in terms of the links that we shared today. You will notice if you pull the chat box, you can access every single bit of material that's been shared. There's lots of opportunities to start mobilizing right now in communication. We will be following up with a report from the entire session. Likewise, the IFMAT report, the Indian Forestry Assessment Report, is coming out later this year, so we can send that to those that participated in these sessions, since it's very on topic in terms of the discussions we've had. And we do encourage you, if you are interested in discussing this further, or participating or sharing your success stories on the implementation of the wildfire crisis, please reach out to our team at the National Center, and we'll get you in touch with folks, or you can reach out to the Intertribal Timber Council or Brian's team with the Wildfire Risk Infrastructure team. So if you have any of those interests for success stories, or contributing or adding to the report out for these dialogue sessions, please let us know. Want to thank everybody again. There's some follow-up in terms of additional dialogues that folks have asked, but we do appreciate all of you joining us for these last 4 sessions, taking the time to participate, and please feel free to take a look at those videos for additional review of some of the great opportunities we already know are being implemented. So many thanks. We'll end a little early today, and we will be in touch. As Cody said, this is a ongoing project. We'll be communicating ongoing on this. So thank you so much, everyone.